to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today, I don't want to talk about one specific book that I read, but rather because we've reached the end of the calendar year. If you subscribe to the concepts of time and yearly cycles, which some people don't, and that's understandable, but over here at Around the Weird, we unfortunately do subscribe to those things. I wanted to talk about the books that I read at the end of the year, specifically 10 books that I read that I thought were really great. Whether they're comic books, short stories, or novels, I wanted to talk about what I particularly enjoyed this year. So the following is going to be a list of 10 books that I enjoyed, 10 pieces of literary media that I enjoyed. I want to give a shout out to A Wish in the Dark by Christina Soontornvat. I thought that was an exceptional book, really good, and it probably would have ended up on my end of the year list if I hadn't read it so late in the year. I'm trying to figure out still if it's one of the best of the year, or if I'm dealing with the recency effect and it's just I read it recently, so I think it's great, but it's still pretty great regardless. I just didn't want to put it on this top 10 list, but it still has a special mention because it was great, and I think that my not putting it on the list is me being more picky than anything else and just not wanting to put the book somewhere on there. But I think you could argue that it shares a spot with the number 10 book that I'm going to talk about because they were of similar quality. So maybe I might talk about that later. So without further ado, let's talk about the 10 books that I loved. If you have anything to say about them, add them below in the comment section or simply tell me what your favorite books were. So the first book that I'd say that I really loved, and I'm going sort of chronological order on the books that I read, so going from the beginning of the year to the end. So the first book that's on my list, these are in no particular order. I keep interrupting myself, but I should stress no particular order, just going chronologically by what I read. The first book is A Wizard of Ertsy by Ursula K. Le Guin, an amazing book, one that I was not expecting to be good. I wasn't expecting it to be terrible either. It's just I had read The Ones Who Walk Away from Melis by Ursula K. Le Guin, and I expected it to have a similar vibe to that. And while it does have the same quality, it's nothing like that. So I guess just reading her short story kind of influenced my opinion. And really everything that I read from Le Guin so far has been very different. She's a very talented writer, and A Wizard of Earthsea was a beautiful demonstration of that. Everything from the prose to the story to some of the themes she was working with were amazing. And I really like how she made the main character, Jed, he had his faults. He wasn't some perfect little wizard boy in his wizard school who never could do anything wrong and was one-dimensional. No, we really see his fears and his hopes and his cockiness on display at times. And I think that's wonderful. It really helped make him a standout character. And everything else about the story, from including the villain, which is, spoiler alert, but the villain is just the shadow creature that Jed creates. And is it really a manifestation of evil, or is it just the darker part of Jed? You can make any argument there. But I really think Le Guin did an excellent job with this story. And I'm glad I read it at the beginning of the year because, starting off with something really powerful. So definitely recommend this to you if you haven't read it already. Number 2 on my list is Watchmen by Alan Moore. I thought it was pretty wonderful. If it might be a little overbearing at times, Alan Moore has a tendency to go off on weird tangents, as we've seen with many of his stories, including V for Vendetta. I also think that he's overbearing with a little bit of his themes, but when his storytelling really clicks, it's there. I thought that what I really liked about it was how a lot of the characters were kind of darker reflections or a sort of satire of modern of superheroes at the time. You had Dr. Manhattan, who was like Superman, an all-powerful being, and like, would an all-powerful being really care about saving people? Probably not. They'd have their own concerns to worry about, such as being a god. And there's also Ozymandias, who is really a villain, and Rorschach, who lives by his own morality, which is that there really isn't a morality. And the interesting thing about that is how it raises the question of like, is Batman, Spider-Man, all those heroes, are they truly good if they're not really going off of the shared sense of what is good, and if evil demands more of the world or something like that? There's a lot of ideas that Alan Moore throws out there, and it's a really solid comic collection that I recommend that you read. Although it's very understandable if some people might not like it, just because Alan Moore can be overbearing, like kind of preachy in a way, but I felt that his preachy nature didn't impair the story at all. In fact, I think a lot of the panels are quite iconic, including like Dr. Manhattan being ripped apart, or people fighting in riots, and you have the superheroes firing upon them. So a lot of interesting and very beautiful comic pieces right there that I think that make it worth reading, and that's why it's on my list. Number 3 was White Negroes by Lauren Michelle Jackson. This was a book that was recommended to me by my friend Bevan. So thank you, Bevan, for recommending one of the best books that I read this year. I read this for the book club that I was a part of, and although you could really place any of the books that I read for the book club onto this list at the end of the year, what really stood out to me was White Negroes, specifically because I already knew about cultural appropriation, but I didn't know the extent to which it was ingrained in society. For example, Twitter and the use of black slang, of slang from certain communities, especially communities of color. Like, I knew that was there, and I knew that it was quickly co-opted by the public, but I didn't know that I was, like, just by tweeting about that sort of stuff, like, and using words ironically, that it was helping with the cultural appropriation. And knowing how I'm involved in that, I can at least be more aware of what I'm saying online, and also, let other people know, hey, what you're doing might be cultural appropriation. I really enjoyed reading White Negroes, and I felt like it was a lot to really live by, or at least carry with me as I engage in social justice in the future. So definitely a must read if you're into nonfiction and understanding social justice type things. The 5th book on my list is Nightfall, the Nightfall Saga Volume 1 by Chuck Dixon et al. Many authors, many artists involved there. Then I'm kind of cheating here because the Nightfall Saga is actually multiple editions of comics, but I'm counting the entire first volume as a singular thing. And I really enjoyed reading through the first volume. As I said in the video that I made for this, it's pure, uncut, adrenaline-soaked violence. And usually violence in comic books is a little not necessary at times, or is kind of, I want to say, it's a detriment to comics, because comics are supposed to be fun in most regards, and just inserting a whole bunch of violence in it just makes it too edgy, in my opinion. It's a problem that I think Watchmen sort of has at times, but I think Nightfall manages to bypass it, because all the violence that's included in this story serves the plot further. Bane is a very violent man who was born into a violent system, and all he knows is how to be violent. That is how he gains power. So he introduces more violence into Gotham. And it's not like the Joker who introduces chaos. Like, I feel like most of Batman villains are more into chaos than they are into violence in general. But Bane is only interested in violence. So he has Batman fight his rogues gallery one by one by one, and then he shows up and breaks Batman's back. And then Azrael takes over for Batman because he's injured, and it's just a duke between Azrael and Bane because they both believe violence is the key. And also, like, Bane sees Azrael as a threat, and Azrael sees Bane as a usurper to his kingdom in Gotham, because Azrael is as insane as the rest of Batman's villains, which Batman learns a little too late. But I like all of this and how Dixon and company explore this violent theme and really create one of the best action-y type of comic books that I've read in quite some time. I think that it's a classic for a reason. However, I think that maybe the one issue with it is it might have influenced comics a little bit too much in the 90s, because it seems like every comic that I read after the 90s, it focused definitely a lot more on violence. So maybe they learned the wrong lessons from Nightfall, but still, I enjoyed it a lot, and I think that there's a lot to be gained by exploring villains in different styles than just chaos or maybe just violence. So go check that out if you haven't done it already. Number 6 on my list is one that I love to talk about, The Dog by Cesar Ira. That is a short story, and I thought about not including it on it, but because of my experience with it and how funny it was, I decided to include it on the list. For those who don't remember, The Dog was about a man who was on a bus, sees a dog chasing a bus, remembers that he might have abused that dog in the past, and then quickly tries to justify his actions or like wish away the dog in some way. But then the bus stops, the dog gets on and bites him. It's a very short story, but it's very funny and very interesting in how we try to justify our actions and try to assert that, the past that where we did some bad things didn't actually happen. And then just the ending, where it's just like you can try to wish away all these sorts of things, but in the end your past is going to catch up with you. Often it's going to bite you in a terrible way, but I thought Cesar Ira was really good with the storytelling in that short story, and so that's why it's on my end of the year list. Number 7 is Being Human by Judith Heumann. I thought it was an amazing autobiography by a wonderful civil rights activist. Again, this is another book that was part of the book club I am with my friend Bevan, but I actually recommended this book mainly because it's related to my field. I'm in an accessibility, disability services type thing, and so I really wanted to read this because Judith Heumann is like one of the leaders of the 70s and 80s civil rights movements, and so especially the disability civil rights movement. So I thought it'd be an interesting read, and I was really blown away, not only by the struggle that she talked about, but also how she touched upon how it was necessary to engage in other civil rights movements too, because a rising tide lifts all boats, first and foremost, but also there's something to be learned by how those groups are responding to their civil injustices, how they are protesting, what they're doing, and how you can incorporate that into your movements. So Judith Heumann was really getting at how we're even though we might have different identities, we're all struggling but because of the powers that be, and it benefits us to work together rather than focus on our issues separately. So a lot to think about with her biography. I definitely recommend that you read it. Maybe this is something that I recommend the most just because of its connection to me, but also a lot of people don't know about the history of disability civil rights. So this would be a great eye-opener if you don't know that already. The 8th book that is on my list is Indian Horse by Richard Wagamese. This is the 3rd book that I encountered in my book club with my friend Bevan. So, just recommending great books all around. But what really stood out to me with Indian Horse was its portrayal of the uncompromising portrayal of the Native American boarding school system, especially in Canada, but it's something that you'd also probably find in the United States. How the church that ran it essentially were that the people from that church were abusive, sexually and physically so. They were willing to kill natives who didn't conform to this system, and they really did everything in their power to inflict the most amount of trauma. Maybe not intentionally, but that's how it turned out. And then seeing how that plays out in a teenager and young adult who is very interested in hockey, and what he learns from all that trauma and how he carries it with him through life. I thought Richard Wagamese was an amazing storyteller in that regard. Like, his prose is powerful and left me feeling so many different emotions. And the ending is just, it made me cry, and I'm tearing up thinking about it now, but it's just like, it's a powerful ending. Maybe one of the more powerful endings of the books that I've read this year, just because of what Richard Wagamese is trying to say. Essentially, he's arguing we are more than what they did to us. And that's a hard lesson for anyone to learn and to carry with you, because you want someone to face justice for what they've done to you. But often that doesn't happen. And we're left with those feelings, and we want to escape those, but it's hard to escape our own emotions and our own mental health issues. So, like, Richard Wagamese is arguing that, like, we have to try to escape that cycle, or it's just gonna give us generational trauma, even cultural trauma. So a lot to really think about, and I definitely recommend this book this year. The 9th book on my list is The Sandman, volume 11, I think it is. It's The Wake. Now, this is an interesting add-on to my list because there was a number of good Neil Gaiman stories that I read this year. But The Wake especially stands out to me because of what happened earlier in the year. Back in August, my dad died, and it's interesting because the weeks prior, I had actually checked out The Wake from the library because it was the next volume in the Sandman series, which I was taking a look at. And I took a break from reading for a little bit, and then after I came back, one of the first things that I read was The Wake. And I was just like, wow, it hit me really hard because it got at a lot of the emotions that I was feeling after my dad had died. In The Wake, Gaiman really explores the emotions we feel after someone dies. How do we remember someone, especially if they weren't perfect? And also dealing with cycles of regeneration and new beginnings. And I thought Neil Gaiman, like, just for this story alone, not just because of its connection to me, but the things he says and how he explores all of that. He's a powerful writer. He's one of the best writers of maybe the 20th and 21st centuries. Maybe more so the 21st century, because that's when a lot more of his work was published. But he does some pretty amazing things in The Wake, and if not for how it made me feel, like just the ideas that he expresses there and how he's able to make it all come together, I think it's a solid entry in the series and one of the better reads that I read this year. And so the last book on my list, the 10th book, is At Night We Walk in Circles by Daniel Ellercon. As I noted earlier, this could have been easily interchangeable with A Wish in the Dark by Christina Soontornvat. Both of them excellent books. But I think what stands out to me the most is At Night We Walk in Circles. Whereas A Wish in the Dark, it's great from beginning to end. I think At Night We Walk in Circles is very slow, and much of the story doesn't work without the ending. But damn, what an ending it has! If you don't remember, the ending is basically the character that we were following along with ends up in prison because they were accused of murder. Whether or not they murdered someone, we don't actually know. We're just hearing that. And so we've been following this story from the reporting that someone has been doing since the beginning of the events that were taking place. And the person who's been telling the story visits the main character in prison, and the main character's like, "Why are you telling my story?" They take the other characters' like recording equipment, and they're just like, the idea is that they weren't telling an accurate story because they weren't telling that person's perspective. They were only telling the perspective from other people. And I think it really works in the end, because we're left wondering, like, did all of that as it was described actually happen? Is it possible that the main character might have actually committed the murder? Because we're led to believe that he was a nice and gentle boy, but maybe that's what other people want you to believe. And that's not actually the case for that character, who for a large part hasn't been able to tell his own story. And I think it's brilliant. Like, Daniel Ellercon kind of undoes our understanding of the entire story in that last chapter. Given the story, it doesn't really work unless you have that ending, because otherwise it's just a generic, sad story about a character going to prison. But because he has that ending, and maybe that's how stories work. They have to have really good endings for it all to come together. And Daniel Ellercon does that. So, I'm kind of torn between that and A Wish in the Dark, but both stories are excellent. So maybe they get tied for 10th place. I know that's kind of a cop-out, but it's really hard to choose between those two books. I was really torn for the longest time. And I guess that goes to show you how many really excellent books I've read in 2021. Hopefully I have the same experience in 2022. Anyway, those were the 10 or maybe 11 dopest books that I read in 2021. I'll have a list for some books that I want to read in 2022 coming out pretty soon. But yeah, if you have anything to say about this list, or if you think you have some different opinions about those books that you might have read, feel free to comment below and let me know. Let's have a discussion. That is what this BookTube channel is all about. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that maybe other people can find out about these excellent books. And also maybe people can find out about this BookTube channel. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and book reading travels. Farewell.